Good evening, fellow Tarnished. Tonight we are going into one of the most complex characters in all of Elden Ring. Please leave a comment with where in the world you are listening from, and drop a like if you enjoy these. Subscribe if you want to be here for future stories. It helps more than you might think. To understand Elden Ring, you have to understand Marika. Not just as the distant goddess whose shattered image greets you at the foot of the Erdtree, and not just as the figure whose choices set the entire world of the lands between into motion, but as a person, a being with a history, with relationships, with grief, and with motivations that the game only reveals slowly and in fragments. She is at the center of everything, and yet she is almost entirely absent from the events of the game itself. What remains of her is consequence. The Shattering, the demigods, the Tarnished, the fractured Golden Order, all of it flows from decisions she made across an enormous span of time. What makes her story even more complicated is that she did not travel through that time alone, even in the most literal sense. Radagon of the Golden Order, her second husband and one of the most powerful figures in the game's history, is not a separate person. He is Marika. They are the same being, existing as two expressions of a single identity. This is one of the most unusual narrative choices in the game, and it is also one of the most meaningful. Because Radagon and Marika did not simply share a body. In many ways, they disagreed with each other. They wanted different things. The tension between those two sets of desires is woven into nearly every major event in the history of the lands between. This video is going to walk through all of it. We will start with what we know of Marika's origins, follow her rise to divinity, trace her relationships and her children, examine what Radagon was and what his existence meant, and then work through the Shattering itself and what her imprisonment at the end of the game tells us about her intentions. There is a lot of ground to cover, and some of it involves genuine uncertainty, because Elden Ring does not always give us clean answers. Where the lore is ambiguous, we will say so. But there is more than enough to piece together a coherent and deeply human story underneath all the mythology. Before we can talk about Marika herself, it helps to understand the world she was born into, and the people she came from. The lands between, as the player encounters it, is a world already shaped by the Erdtree and the Golden Order. But that was not always the case. There was an earlier era, one the game refers to through its item descriptions and environmental details, rather than through any direct narration. And understanding that era gives you a clearer picture of what Marika inherited, what she changed, and what she replaced. The period before the Golden Order's dominance is associated with something the game calls the Crucible. This is not a single event or a specific organization. It is more of a description of a primordial condition. In the Crucible, life in the lands between was more fluid and intermingled than it would later become. The boundaries between species and forms were not fixed in the way the Golden Order would eventually enforce. Creatures bore traits from multiple lineages. A being might have the characteristics of both a beast and a man, or carry within its body the remnants of something ancient and difficult to categorize. The Crucible Knights, who appear throughout the game as formidable enemies clad in ancient armor, are relics of this period. They served under an earlier version of the Divine Order, one that predates Marika's ascension. This earlier state of the world was not chaotic in a destructive sense. It simply operated according to different principles. Life was messier, more intermingled, more difficult to categorize. The Golden Order, when it came, imposed structure. It defined what was sacred and what was not, what forms of life were sanctioned and which were heretical. This shift from the Crucible to the Golden Order is one of the most significant transformations in the history of the lands between, and it is inseparable from Marika's rise. The world during this period was also populated by powers that would later be diminished or destroyed. The ancient dragons held enormous influence. The giant kingdoms existed. The eternal cities, Nokron and Nokstella, were active civilizations rather than buried ruins. The Erdtree itself was not yet the singular dominant presence it would become. There were multiple forces, multiple cosmological powers, and the lands between was a place where those forces existed in an uneasy and contested relationship with one another. Into this world, Marika was born. She was a Numen, which is a human subgroup described in the game's lore as beings who originally came from outside the lands between. The Numen are not extensively documented. What we know is that they are mortal humans with a notably low birth rate and a particular proximity to the outer gods. They are, in a sense, already adjacent to the divine before any of them become gods themselves. This makes the Numen an interesting people to think about, because they carry within their lineage a kind of readiness for divine contact that ordinary humans may not share. The Black Knife assassins, who will be important later in this story, were also Numen women. That connection is not incidental. Marika's early life is almost entirely undocumented. We know she was associated with Ul Palace, which is referenced in connection with the Numen homeland, but the specifics of her childhood, her family, and the circumstances of her early years are not preserved in any item description the game provides. She enters the historical record as someone who has already begun her rise, which is itself a kind of statement. The game is not interested in her as a child or as an ordinary person. By the time she becomes visible to us, she is already becoming something else. What we do know is that at some point, Marika came into contact with the Greater Will. The Greater Will is the outer god that would come to define the entire cosmology of the lands between. It is described as a being of immense but distant power, one that communicates through the two fingers and their human interpreters, and that has a clear interest in imposing order on the world. It is not a god in any warm or personal sense. It is closer to a cosmic force with an agenda. It does not appear to love or grieve or desire in any human way. What it wants is order, and the perpetuation of that order through a divine framework it can influence from a distance. The Greater Will works through chosen vessels called Empyreans. An Empyrean is a being of sufficient spiritual capacity to become a god, to serve as the physical anchor for the Greater Will's divine presence in the lands between. Empyreans are rare. The game names only a few. Marika herself, Rani, Miquella, and Malenia, though not all of them were selected or accepted by the Greater Will in the same way. Being an Empyrean is not simply a title of honor. It means being a candidate for a role that involves holding the Elden Ring and maintaining the divine order it represents. It is, in other words, a form of service, one that comes with enormous power, but also with obligations that the Greater Will expects to be fulfilled. When Marika made contact with the Greater Will and was recognized as an Empyrean, she was set on a path that would take her from a mortal Numen woman to the god of the lands between. What that transition required of her, what she gave up and what she gained, is not something the game describes in detail, but the outcome is clear. She rose, and in rising, she began the process of reshaping the world into something the Greater Will wanted it to be. Marika's ascension to godhood did not happen in a quiet or purely spiritual sense. The world she inherited was already occupied by other powers, and bringing the Golden Order into dominance required more than divine appointment. It required warfare. The history of the lands between before the Golden Order's consolidation involves conflicts with giant kingdoms, with ancient dragons, with Crucible-era creatures and civilizations that had existed long before the Erdtree's light became the central organizing principle of life in the region. These were not small skirmishes. They were sustained campaigns that played out over what the lore implies were very long stretches of time. To lead those campaigns, Marika needed a warrior of exceptional capability and loyalty. She found that in Godfrey, the man who would become the first Elden Lord. Godfrey is one of the most striking figures in the game's backstory, and he is worth understanding carefully because his story is directly linked to everything that follows. He was a warrior before Marika chose him, already distinguished in battle, already known for a kind of ferocity that he struggled to govern. He carried upon his shoulders a beast called Serosh, a great golden lion who had merged with him and who served as a kind of spiritual restraint on his more violent instincts. Godfrey was someone who could have become purely destructive if left to his own nature. Serosh helped him channel that nature into something that could also build, not just destroy. Marika chose Godfrey as her first husband. Their marriage was a union that served both personal and political purposes in the way that most significant relationships in divine mythologies tend to operate. Together they had 3 children. The first was Godwyn the Golden, who would become one of the most beloved figures in the history of the lands between. The second and third were the twins Malenia and Miquella, both of whom were Empyreans themselves, carrying divine potential within them from birth. The campaigns that Godfrey led under Marika's authority were extensive. The giant kingdoms were subjugated. The ancient dragons, who had held significant power over the lands between for an enormous period of time, were eventually brought to terms, though not entirely through military defeat. Godwyn the Golden played a particular role in establishing peace with the dragons, entering into something closer to a treaty than a conquest, a detail that speaks to his character and that distinguishes him from the more purely martial traditions of his father. The Crucible-era creatures were pushed to the margins. The eternal cities, Nokron and Nokstella, were driven underground, literally buried beneath the lands between, their people sealed away from the surface world. What replaced all of this was the Golden Order. The Erdtree became the central presence of the lands between, its golden light visible from virtually anywhere in the region. The faith of the Golden Order became the governing religion. The two fingers served as interpreters of the divine will, guiding the faithful and maintaining the theological framework of the new order. Institutions were built. Leyndell grew into a capital city at the base of the Erdtree. The Round Table Hold became a gathering place for those who served the Order's interests. The world was organized, structured, and given a clear hierarchy of divine and mortal authority with Marika at the top. One of the most significant theological acts of this early period was Marika's handling of death. The Rune of Death, which governed the natural end of life and the passage of souls beyond the world, was removed from the Elden Ring and sealed away within the concept of destined death. Without the Rune of Death active in the Divine Order, the dead did not pass on in the conventional sense. Instead, they returned to the Erdtree's grace, their souls and bodies eventually absorbed back into its roots and its light, to be recycled into the continuing life of the world. This meant that those who lived under the Golden Order could not truly die in any final way. They would always return to the Erdtree, always come back under its light. This sounds, on its surface, like a mercy. No permanent loss. No true ending. But it also meant that the Erdtree held a claim on the dead that could not be refused. There was no escape from the Divine Order, not even through death. Every person who died under the Golden Order was, in a sense, returned to the institution they had lived within. The Erdtree's roots spread through the ground beneath the lands between, and the souls of the dead fed those roots. The system was closed, the Greater Will's order recycled everything back into itself, and nothing could exit it. Whether Marika removed the Rune of Death with full understanding of what that meant for the people living under the Order, or whether she did it primarily to secure the Golden Order's stability, is not something the game resolves. Both motivations are possible, so is the possibility that she removed it because the Greater Will directed her to, and that her own feelings about the decision developed later, over time. The campaigns led by Godfrey eventually reached an end. There were no more kingdoms to subdue. No more powers contesting the Golden Order's dominance. The lands between were as consolidated as they were going to get, and the era of active military conquest was over. What happened to Godfrey in the wake of that peace is one of the more quietly important events in the entire history of the game's world. Godfrey lost his grace. In the world of Elden Ring, grace is the divine quality granted by the Erdtree to those it favors, a kind of spiritual vitality that marks someone as being within the Golden Order's blessing. To lose grace is to become tarnished, to be stripped of that divine favor and placed outside the Order's protection and recognition. For most people, becoming tarnished was a form of exile and diminishment. But Godfrey's situation was different, and the manner in which it happened suggests that Marika understood exactly what was occurring and allowed it to proceed. Godfrey was a warrior by nature. His purpose, the thing that had given his life its shape and direction, was conquest and combat. Sarosh had helped him govern the destructive aspects of that nature, but the underlying drive was still there. When there were no more wars to fight, that drive had nowhere to go. The Erdtree, which sustains and recognizes those who serve its purposes, appears to have withdrawn its grace from Godfrey simply because he no longer had a clear function within the Order. He was not punished. He was, in a sense, retired by the divine system, which had no place for a great war leader in a time of peace. Marika's response to this is described across several item descriptions in ways that make her intent reasonably clear. She did not simply allow Godfrey to fade into an undistinguished exile. She sent him away with purpose. She exiled Godfrey and the warriors who followed him, sending them out beyond the lands between to continue fighting, to be shaped by conflict in the wider world. The Tarnished who followed Godfrey into exile multiplied over generations into a people who lived outside the Erdtree's grace, traveling the lands beyond and becoming hardened by the struggles they encountered there. The item descriptions associated with the Tarnished as a people, and with the nature of the grace that eventually calls them back to the lands between, strongly suggest that Marika intended this exile as a form of preparation rather than punishment. She was creating a reserve of capable individuals who had not been formed by the politics and the corruption of the Golden Order. People who existed outside the system she had built, and who might, one day, be called back to serve a purpose that the system itself could not fulfill. The Tarnished are, in this reading, Marika's contingency plan. She was already thinking, at the moment of Godfrey's exile, about the possibility that her divine order might eventually fail. This is a significant thing to sit with. The Golden Order was at the height of its power. The Erdtree dominated the landscape. The faith was consolidated, and Marika was already planning for its collapse. Whether she knew what specific form that collapse would take, or whether she simply understood that no order lasts forever, and she wanted something in reserve when it ended, we cannot say. But the structure of what she set up is clear in retrospect. Godfrey goes out, the Tarnished form, and they wait, without knowing they are waiting, for the grace that will eventually call them home. After Godfrey's exile, the historical record shows a period of relative stability before the next major development. That development was Radagon. He appears in the lore first as a military commander of the Golden Order's forces, specifically in the context of a conflict with the Carian royals of Liurnia. The Carians were practitioners of glintstone sorcery, a magical tradition rooted in the study of the stars rather than in the theology of the Erdtree. Glintstone sorcery was not directly condemned by the Golden Order, but it operated outside the Order's divine framework, drawing on principles that had nothing to do with the Erdtree's grace. The Carian royal family, led by Queen Rennala, was the most prominent institution practicing and teaching this tradition through the Academy of Raya. The conflict between the Golden Order and the Carians did not end in a straightforward military conquest. Instead, it ended in a marriage. Radagon wed Rennala, and through that union, a peace was established between the Golden Order and the Carian tradition. This was a politically effective resolution. The Academy of Raya was incorporated into the broader Order's tolerance, and the Carians retained their autonomy in exchange for no longer being in active opposition. For Rennala, the marriage appears to have been more than a political arrangement. The item descriptions and environmental details associated with her character make clear that she loved Radagon genuinely, that she was devoted to him in a way that was personal and deep rather than merely diplomatic. Radagon and Rennala had 3 children together. The first was Radagon, who would grow into one of the most powerful warriors in the history of the lands between, a student of the Carian sorceress tradition, and also of his father's martial capabilities, known for his mastery of gravity magic and for a physical size that dwarfed ordinary men. The second was Rykard, who would become the Lord of Volcano Manor and would eventually pursue a form of heresy so severe that it resulted in him fusing with the god-devouring serpent in a deliberate act of defiance against the Golden Order. The third was Ronnie, whose story we have covered in depth in a previous video on this channel, and who pursued the Age of Stars and the removal of the Erdtree's influence from the lands between. All 3 of these children are marked by their dual inheritance. They carry in them the Golden Order blood of their father and the Carian sorceress tradition of their mother, and the tension between those 2 lineages plays out differently in each of them. Radagon remained a warrior loyal to his own principles. Rykard rejected the divine order entirely. Ronnie sought to replace it with something else. None of them are simple figures, and none of their stories can be understood without understanding that their father eventually left. Because Radagon left, he abandoned Rennala, ended the marriage, and returned to Leyndell. This is a fact the game establishes without dwelling on its emotional weight, but the weight is there. Rennala was left with 3 children and with an amber egg that Radagon gave her at his departure, described in item text as something she has never stopped treasuring. The great library of Raya, where she remains for the entirety of the game, is a space she has retreated into. She recreates her beloved students as fragile illusions. She cradles the amber egg. She has not recovered from Radagon's departure, and the game gives no indication that she ever will. The reason Radagon left is connected to the revelation that follows. When Radagon returned to Leyndell, he was elevated to the position of Elden Lord, Marika's second husband and the new head of the military and political structure of the Golden Order. And then the game tells us, in the moment of the final boss encounter, that Radagon is Marika. The Elden Lord who left Rennala and returned to the goddess was the goddess herself, living as a second identity. The revelation that Marika and Radagon are the same being is the narrative centerpiece of the entire game, and it rewards careful thinking rather than a quick summary. The game does not explain the mechanics of their shared existence in any direct way. What we have are the facts of what happened and the evidence left behind by both of them, and from that evidence we have to construct the most coherent interpretation we can. The most straightforward reading is that Marika, as an Empyrean and as a god, had a capacity that ordinary beings do not possess. She was able to split her identity into two separate expressions, each of which could move through the world independently. Radagon was not a costume or a performance. He had his own relationships. He fathered children who grew up knowing him as their father. He made independent decisions that shaped the political history of the lands between. He had a scholarly life and a theological perspective that was his own. The children he had with Rennala are not Marika's children in any sense that the game presents as straightforward. They are Radagon's children. And Radagon was a real presence in their lives, until he was not. This raises a question that the game also does not answer directly. Did Radagon know he was Marika? Did he experience himself as a separate person, or did he carry within him some awareness of the larger identity he was part of? The evidence suggests that the division was genuine enough that Radagon and Marika could want different things. The most compelling proof of this is what happens after the Shattering. Marika broke the Elden Ring, and Radagon, according to item descriptions in the game, attempted to repair it. The same being, through two expressions of its identity, both destroyed and tried to restore the central object of the divine order. If they were simply one person with no meaningful internal division, that contradiction would be impossible. The fact that it happened is the strongest argument that whatever the mechanism of their shared existence, the two identities had developed genuine independence from each other. The implications for the people around them are significant. Rennala loved a person who was, in some sense, a god living as a man, and who eventually returned to that divine identity and left her behind. She never knew the full nature of what she had married. The children Radagon had with her grew up with a father who was, beneath the identity they knew, the Elden Lord's consort and the god of the lands between. Ranni's pursuit of the Age of Stars, her desire to move the world out from under the Erdtree's influence, takes on an additional dimension when you consider that her father was that influence, or at least was part of the being that embodied it. The children Marika had with Godfrey, on the other side, were raised in the full knowledge of their mother's divine status. Godwyn, Malenia, and Miquella grew up as children of the goddess. Their identity was shaped by that proximity to divinity in ways that were different from what Radagon, Rykard, and Ranni experienced. The two families are, in a sense, the two sides of a divided being made visible in the world through relationships and children. The marriage between Radagon and Marika, when Radagon returned to Leyndell, is one of the stranger concepts in the game's mythology. A being married itself. Or, more precisely, the two expressions of a divided identity were formally reunited in the institution of marriage, which the Golden Order used to confer the title of Elden Lord. Whether this was a political necessity, a theological requirement, or something more personal is not explained. But the outcome was that Radagon became the second Elden Lord, the most powerful human position in the lands between, and the two halves of Marika's identity were once again formally joined within the structure of the Divine Order. With Radagon elevated to Elden Lord and the Golden Order at its most consolidated, Marika's children from both relationships occupied powerful positions within the structure of the lands between. It is worth taking some time with each of them individually, not only because their stories are interesting in themselves, but because understanding them helps clarify what the Shattering ultimately destroyed and why its consequences were so severe. Godwyn the Golden, Marika's firstborn with Godfrey, was by all accounts the most beloved figure of his generation. Item descriptions throughout the game reference him with a consistency of admiration that is rare in Elden Ring's lore, which tends to present even its most celebrated figures with some degree of ambivalence. Godwyn appears to have been genuinely good in a way that was recognized by everyone around him. He was a warrior who did not pursue war for its own sake. He made peace with the ancient dragons rather than simply defeating them, establishing a treaty that is referenced in the lore surrounding the dragon communion traditions still present in the game. He was generous, warm, and by the accounts preserved in item descriptions, someone who made the people around him feel valued. His mother loved him. The people of the lands between loved him. Even the dragons, who had every reason to resent the civilization that had diminished them, appeared to have respected him. Malenia, the twin-born of Marika and Godfrey, carried within her body the scarlet rot, a manifestation of an outer god entirely separate from the greater will. This rot expressed itself through her body in ways that required her to cover much of herself in prosthetics, and that made her both fearsome and tragic. She was one of the most skilled warriors in the history of the Lands Between, perhaps the most skilled, and her story during and after the Shattering is one of the game's most famous narrative threads. Her duel with Radagon is the event that devastated both of them and transformed a significant portion of the Lands Between into the rot-covered wasteland known as Caelid. We will return to this when we discuss the Shattering's consequences. Miquella, the other twin, was an Empyrean who pursued his own agenda during the period leading up to the Shattering. He attempted to create an alternative haven for those who suffered from the Golden Order's exclusions, specifically the Albinaurics and others who existed at the margins of the Order's grace. The Erdtree was his project, a great tree grown through his own golden blood that he intended as a sanctuary outside the Erdtree's hierarchy. His story connects to Ranni's in complicated ways and involves elements of the game's mythology around dreams and sacrifice that we will not go into in full depth here, but his existence as an Empyrean and his distance from the Golden Order's mainstream are relevant to understanding the state of Marika's family in the period before the Shattering. On Radagon's side, Radagon had become a figure of considerable renown as a warrior and military leader. His mastery of gravity magic, which he had studied under the Carian tradition he inherited from his mother, made him one of the most powerful combatants in the Lands Between. He used that mastery to hold the stars in place above his domain of Caelid, a detail that connects to Ranni's story and to the broader politics of the Age of Stars. Rykard had established himself at Volcano Manor in the Altus Plateau region, already drifting toward the heretical position he would eventually commit to entirely. And Ranni had removed herself from the expectations of her Empyrean status and was pursuing the path that would lead to the events of the game. The state of the Golden Order in this period, despite its apparent consolidation, was already showing the pressures that would eventually break it. The Erdtree's hold on death meant that the Order was genuinely inescapable for those living under it. The theological hierarchy maintained by the Two Fingers and the Golden Order's clergy was rigid and exclusionary. Those who fell outside the Order's definitions of sanctioned life, such as the Albinaurics, occupied a diminished position. The outer gods, of which the greater will was only one, exerted influences on the world that the Golden Order could not fully contain or address. And Marika herself, at the center of all of this, was carrying something that was moving her toward the act that would change everything. Before the Shattering, there was another catastrophe. The Night of the Black Knives is the event that destabilized the Golden Order and that set the Shattering in motion. It begins and ends with Godwyn the Golden, and it involves a theft and an assassination that the game connects to multiple figures and motivations without ever giving a single clean explanation. The Black Knife Assassins were a group of Numen women, the same people Marika herself came from. This is not a coincidence the game asks you to ignore. The fact that the assassins shared Marika's heritage is part of the deliberate weight of the event. Their daggers had been inscribed with a stolen fragment of the Rune of Death, the aspect of the Elden Ring that Marika had removed and sealed away within the concept of destined death. To use those daggers was to introduce the force of true ending into a world where true ending had been abolished. The assassination of Godwyn was carried out in the night, without warning. He was not killed in battle. He was killed in what should have been a place of safety, and because the daggers carried a fragment of the Rune of Death rather than the full rune, what happened to him was not a clean death. It was something worse. His soul died. The part of him that could return to the Erdtree, that could be received back into the Divine Order's cycle of grace, was ended. But his body was not. His physical form persisted, and because the mechanism that should have resolved his death was broken by the partial nature of the rune used against him, his body did not fade or decay in any ordinary way. Instead, Godwyn's body began to spread. His remains, buried in the depths beneath Leyndell, grew through the Erdtree's roots. Over the course of the years following his death, his body became something enormous and unrecognizable, a vast growth of wrong flesh extending through the underground of the Lands Between. He is given the title Prince of Death's Throne in the game, and the area where his transformed remains are found is one of the most disturbing environments in Elden Ring. He is alive in body and absent in soul, and the spreading death root that corrupts parts of the world is connected to his ongoing physical presence. He is simultaneously a victim and an ongoing source of harm, through no fault of his own. The question of who planned the Night of the Black Knives is one the game raises but does not fully answer. Ranni is the figure most frequently implicated. Item descriptions associated with the Black Knife Assassins and with the Night of the Black Knives suggest her involvement in a way that is difficult to read as coincidental. The daggers required the Rune of Death, and the Rune of Death was something only someone with access to the Elden Ring's inner workings could have provided. Ranni, as an Empyrean, had a kind of proximity to divine structures that most beings did not, whether she acted entirely alone or in coordination with others, and whether Marika had any foreknowledge of what was being planned, is never resolved by the game. What we can say is that the Night of the Black Knives accomplished something that changed the political and emotional landscape of the lands between in irreversible ways. It demonstrated that the Rune of Death could be stolen and weaponized. It killed the most beloved figure of his generation in a manner so wrong that his body became an ongoing problem rather than a resolved death. And it broke Marika. The loss of Godwyn appears to have been the event that moved Marika from whatever complicated relationship she had with the Golden Order into open action against it. Item descriptions associated with her response to Godwyn's death indicate a grief that was total and that did not resolve. She was his mother. He was her firstborn, the child most often described in terms of warmth and love rather than political function, and he was gone in a way that was particularly cruel, present in body and absent in self, in a state that the divine order she maintained had no way to address or remedy. The Erdtree could not receive him. Its grace could not find him. He was outside the system in the most absolute possible way. Marika took the Elden Ring and broke it. This is the central event of the game's history, and almost everything in the world the player explores is shaped by its consequences. The great runes that had composed the Elden Ring were scattered among her children, who became the demigods. Without the Elden Ring to serve as the governing structure of the divine order, the Golden Order lost its coherence. The two fingers, which had served as interpreters of the greater will's intentions, were left without clear direction, and the demigods, each holding a fragment of the broken ring, began to fight each other for dominance. The wars of the Shattering were devastating. They are referenced throughout the game in item descriptions, in the ruined state of the lands between, and in the histories of individual characters and factions. They were not brief or contained conflicts. They spread across the region, drawing in armies and leaving large portions of the land permanently altered. Leyndell, the capital at the foot of the Erdtree, was besieged. The Altus Plateau was fought over. Caelid, as mentioned, was transformed into a wasteland by the confrontation between Malenia and Radagon, an event so destructive that Malenia released the scarlet rot within herself in a moment of desperation, spreading the rot across the entire region and infecting Radagon with it in the process. Neither of them fully recovered. Radagon, once one of the most feared warriors in the lands between, was reduced to a state of mindless hunger by the rot. Malenia retreated to the Halig tree, her bloom having bloomed but her purpose unfulfilled. The question of why Marika shattered the Elden Ring does not have a single answer, and the game is deliberate in presenting multiple possible motivations without endorsing any one of them as definitive. The most immediate and human explanation is grief. She had just lost Godwyn, the child she appears to have loved most deeply, in the worst possible way. The divine order she maintained had failed to protect him. The Rune of Death she had locked away had been stolen and used against her own family. Whatever faith she had placed in the greater will and its design for the world may have collapsed in the aftermath of the Night of the Black Knives. Shattering the Elden Ring was, in this reading, an act of a mother who had been broken by loss and who responded by breaking the thing that had broken her family. But the game offers a deeper reading as well. Marika had been living for a very long time as the vessel of the greater will's order. She had built that order through decades of warfare and political consolidation. She had removed the Rune of Death, regulated the passage of souls, and maintained the framework that kept the Erdtree's influence dominant over the entire lands between. And there is evidence throughout the game that she had come to question whether that order was just or whether it was simply a mechanism for the greater will's continued influence, rather than something that genuinely served the people living within it. The endings of the game are relevant here. The player's choices at the end determine the future of the lands between, and several of those choices involve breaking free from the greater will's influence entirely. The Age of Stars ending, which Rani pursues, removes the Erdtree and its order from the world. The Lord of Frenzied Flame ending undoes everything entirely. Even the Elden Lord endings, which nominally restore some version of the order, often involve modifications to its fundamental principles. The game presents the Greater Will's order not as an obviously good thing that was damaged by the Shattering, but as something whose desirability is genuinely in question. Marika may have reached that conclusion herself long before the player arrives. There is also the matter of the Tarnished. Marika had sent Godfrey and his followers outside the lands between generations before the Shattering. She had done this with what appears to be long-term purpose, creating a people outside the Golden Order who might one day be called back. The Shattering and its aftermath created the conditions for that return. Grace was restored just enough to draw the Tarnished back to the lands between. They arrived in a world that had been broken by war, and that needed someone to either rebuild or replace its governing structure. The Tarnished, having lived outside the Order's influence, were not bound by its allegiances or its politics. They could go where others could not, and do what others would not. Whether Marika planned the Tarnished's return as a deliberate consequence of the Shattering, or whether she acted in grief and the circumstances simply aligned in a way that made their return possible, cannot be determined from the evidence the game provides. Both are plausible. They may both be true simultaneously. The game does not separate Marika's grief from her strategic thinking, and there is no reason to assume that those two things were operating in isolation from each other. Here is where the internal division between Marika and Radagon becomes most visible. After the Elden Ring was shattered, Radagon did not simply accept what had happened. Item descriptions in the game, particularly those associated with his theological and scholarly work, indicate that he attempted to repair the Elden Ring after it was broken. He tried to put back together what Marika had destroyed. This is an extraordinary fact. The same being, expressed as two identities, had both shattered the Elden Ring and then worked to restore it. The contradiction is not a narrative error. It is a deliberate expression of the internal conflict that had been building within Marika's divided existence for an enormous span of time. Radagon believed in the Golden Order. He had spent his life strengthening it, studying its theological foundations, working to make the divine framework more stable and more enduring. When Marika broke the Elden Ring, she was repudiating everything he had dedicated himself to, and his response was to try to fix it. He failed. The Elden Ring remained shattered. Its great runes remained scattered among the demigods. The wars of the Shattering continued, and Radagon, or the being that contained both Radagon and Marika, was eventually punished by the greater will for what had been done. The final boss sequence of Elden Ring can be read as a direct expression of this history. When the player reaches the foot of the Erdtree and confronts the end of the game, they first face Radagon. He is presented as a being who is fighting not to defend the Shattering, but to oppose it. He is trying to prevent the Tarnished from reaching the Elden Ring, and in doing so he is acting in accordance with his own values rather than Marika's. He wants the Order preserved, he wants the Ring protected, and when he is defeated, the Elden Beast emerges, the Greater Will's direct physical agent in the world, the creature that carries the Elden Ring within itself. The sequence moves from Radagon's personal defense of his beliefs to the impersonal mechanism of the Greater Will's last line of enforcement. It is a summary of the entire game's theology in 3 stages. After the Shattering, Marika was punished. The game presents her at its conclusion suspended within the Erdtree's inner sanctum, fused to the Elden Ring itself, her body cracked along lines that suggest both damage and deliberate constraint. The manner of this imprisonment is consistent with what we know of the Greater Will's responses to deviation from its order. She had shattered the thing she was chosen to maintain. The Greater Will, through the Erdtree and the mechanisms it could still exert, responded by making her part of what she had broken, fusing her to the Elden Ring and holding her there. The details of how this imprisonment was carried out are not fully described. We do not know whether it was a sudden act, whether it followed a confrontation with the Two Fingers or with the Elden Beast, or whether it happened gradually as the consequences of the Shattering unfolded. What the game shows us is the result. Marika is still. She is cracked. She is present in the sanctum where the Elden Ring rests, unable to act, unable to intervene in any of the wars or events that followed from her choice. Whether she was imprisoned entirely against her will, or whether some part of her accepted the imprisonment, is another question the game leaves open. There are readings of the lore that suggest Marika may have had reasons to remain close to the Elden Ring even after breaking it. If she was planning for the Tarnished to eventually arrive and interact with the ring, being present within the sanctum might have been part of that plan, rather than simply a consequence of her punishment. But this is interpretation rather than established fact, and it is worth holding loosely. Her physical state in the sanctum is striking in what it does not convey. She does not appear to be suffering in any dramatic sense. She is not reaching out or calling for help. She is simply there, integrated into the structure of the divine order she destroyed, waiting in a way that might be patient or might simply be powerless. The game does not distinguish between those two possibilities, and that ambiguity is part of what makes her such a compelling figure to think about. The most honest assessment of Marika's motivations is that the game presents them with deliberate incompleteness. She does not speak to the player directly. She does not appear in any scene where her intentions are laid out clearly. Everything we know about her is filtered through item descriptions, through the accounts of other characters, and through the evidence left behind by her choices. This is an intentional narrative approach. The game wants you to think about her rather than simply receive an explanation. With that in mind, here is what the evidence supports. Marika was not a simple vessel for the greater will. She was not someone who accepted her role without reservation and carried it out faithfully until an act of grief broke her. The evidence of her long-term thinking, the exile of Godfrey with apparent purpose, the removal of the Rune of Death, the possibility that the Knight of the Black Knives had her at least partial foreknowledge, suggests a being who had been navigating the tension between her divine obligations and her own will for a very long time. She may have resented the greater will's control. She was chosen as an Empyrean before she had any meaningful ability to consent to what that role would require. She was elevated to godhood and made the vessel of a cosmic force's agenda for the lands between, and she held that position for an enormous span of time. The item descriptions associated with the two fingers and with the Golden Order's theology suggest a system that was rigid, that did not tolerate deviation, and that measured sanctity in ways that excluded large portions of the beings living within the lands between. Whether Marika believed in this system when she built it, and whether she continued to believe in it across the centuries, are separate questions. What we can say is that her act of shattering the Elden Ring was not simply destructive. It created possibilities that the intact order would never have allowed. It opened the world to the Tarnished. It created the conditions under which the endings the game offers could become possible, including endings that place the lands between outside the greater will's influence entirely. Whether she intended those specific outcomes or simply intended to break the order without knowing exactly what would replace it, she made space for something other than what had existed before. She also caused enormous harm. The wars of the Shattering were catastrophic. The people of the lands between, the ordinary individuals living under the order she built and then destroyed, suffered the consequences of a divine decision they had no part in making. Rennala, who was entirely innocent of everything connected to the divine order's politics, was broken by Radagon's abandonment and has never recovered. Godwyn's ongoing half-existence spread corruption through the roots of the Erdtree. The demigods tore each other apart over the fragments of the ring. Caelid was transformed into a poisoned wasteland. None of these consequences can be separated from Marika's choices. She was, in the end, a figure who resists any simple characterization. She was chosen by a cosmic force and made into something she may never have fully wanted to be. She built an order through decades of warfare and then dismantled it in a single act. She loved her children, and her choices contributed to the ruin of many of them. She was imprisoned, not just within the Erdtree's sanctum, but within the contradictions of her own existence, a god who did not fully believe in what she was a god of, a being divided against itself in the most literal sense possible. Before closing, it is worth returning to Radagon specifically, not as the counterpart to Marika, but as an existence in himself. Because whatever the metaphysics of his shared identity with Marika, the life he lived was real. The relationships he formed were real. The children he raised were real. And the legacy he left behind is woven into the history of the lands between in ways that are separate from Marika's legacy, even if they originated from the same being. Rennala's love for Radagon is one of the most clearly rendered emotional facts in the game. She is not a character defined by political ambition or theological conviction. She is defined by devotion to someone who left. The amber egg she carries is described in terms that communicate how deeply she valued it and what it represents to her. She has retreated from the world. She recreates illusions of students she once taught. She is present in the library but absent from anything that might be described as functioning life. Whatever else Radagon was, he was someone who was genuinely loved, and his departure caused a harm that has not healed. Radagon grew up knowing his father as a figure of martial and scholarly excellence. He pursued both of those traditions himself, studying the Carian sorceries his mother's family practiced, while also becoming a warrior of enormous physical power. The detail that he used gravity magic to hold the stars in place above Kylid, preventing them from moving in ways that would have affected Ranni's plans, is a gesture of loyalty to his own principles that comes at significant personal cost. He was not simply a product of his parentage, he developed his own values and acted on them. Rykard's rejection of the Golden Order can be read partly as a response to what his father represented. The order that Radagon served and strengthened was one that Rykard found either unjust or simply not worth preserving. His decision to fuse with the god-devouring serpent was an act of deliberate heresy, a statement that he would rather become something the order condemned entirely than continue to exist within its framework. Whether he was responding specifically to his father's abandonment of his mother or to the broader institutional failures of the Golden Order, his story is one of rejection, and Radagon's identity is part of what he was rejecting. Ranni's relationship to her father's identity is perhaps the most complicated. She pursued the removal of the Erdtree's influence from the lands between and the coming of the Age of Stars. Her father was the Elden Lord, the human head of the very institution she was working to dismantle. That she proceeded anyway, and that she drew the Black Knife assassins into events that contributed to the Shattering, suggests that her commitment to her own goals was stronger than any loyalty she felt to her father's legacy. Whether she understood the full nature of what her father was remains uncertain. Radagon himself, in the period between his return to Marika and the end, appears to have channeled his existence into devotion to the Golden Order and to the Elden Ring specifically. He was a theologian as well as a warrior. His work on the Order's philosophical and doctrinal foundations appears throughout the game in item descriptions and in the artifacts associated with his name. He believed in what he was doing. He worked to strengthen it. And then the other half of himself destroyed it, and he spent his final period trying to put it back together, and failed, and died in the sanctum of the Order he had spent his life serving. Marika and Radagon together are one of the most carefully constructed character studies in recent gaming, and the game earns that complexity by never giving you a simple answer about who they were or what they wanted. The information is there, distributed across hundreds of item descriptions and environmental details, but it requires patience to assemble. And what you assemble is not a verdict, it is a portrait. A being chosen before she could consent to what being chosen meant. A god who built a world and then questioned it. A mother who lost a child in a way the divine order she maintained was powerless to address. A figure who made a choice that caused enormous suffering and that may also have opened the only path toward something better. A being divided against itself, one half working to preserve what the other half destroyed, each half genuine in its commitments, neither half fully able to account for the other. The lands between as the player encounters it is defined entirely by her absence. She built it, she broke it, and by the time you arrive, she is suspended at its center, cracked and still, waiting for whatever the Tarnished will choose to do with what remains. She does not intervene, she does not guide. She simply waits, which may be patience, or maybe powerlessness, or maybe something the game deliberately chooses not to resolve. Thank you for spending this evening with Midnight Game Lore. If you made it all the way through, we hope it kept you good company on the way to sleep. If you enjoyed the video, a like and a subscription goes a long way toward helping us continue making these. And if there is a game, a character, or a world you would like us to cover next, leave it in the comments. We are always looking for the next story worth telling. Rest well, and we will see you in the next one.